just talk about that interview with Bob Neill, one of the 29 Tory MPs, as Asma says, who says Boris Johnson should consider his position. William, if I could ask you first, clearly this is building and these things do take time to come to fruition. How do you gauge the mood of the party at the moment?
Well, I think Boris Johnson is in real trouble here. And when an MP as reputable, as experienced, as respected as Bob Neill, who we were just listening to, gives that opinion that he's just been given, that's very serious trouble for the Prime Minister. And I think the Sue Gray report has been one of those sort of slow fuse explosions in politics. It's still going along. A lot of people misread it, really, the events of last week, as meaning, oh, the trouble is over, Boris is free. And that's actually not the mood in the Conservative Party, which is very, very troubled about the contents of that report. So I think the Conservative Party will need to resolve this one way or another, obviously, because to be an effective party, they either need to rally behind the Prime Minister they've got, or they need to decide to force him out. And I think they're moving toward either next week or around the end of June. They are moving towards having a ballot. It looks like that.
So you think it could happen quite quickly?
Well, it could happen quickly. As you've been discussing, there is this system. This is the system I left behind, by the way. This is so I'm a bit of an expert on this system. I oversaw the creation of these rules. And it was designed to make it difficult to challenge an incumbent leader, but possible to get rid of one if there was a real groundswell. And so it strikes a balance. It's got this sort of secretive aspect to it, so that people can write a confidential letter. It's very deliberate that they don't have to say in public that they want a leadership ballot. Yes, I think it looks like it is moving in that direction. But of course, there are other factors here. There are by-elections going on the 23rd of June. Some MPs will want to wait to see what happens in those. And there's the whole Privileges Committee inquiry into whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament. And of course, one can argue that, well, we ought to know the outcome of that before reaching a decision. So different MPs have different timings here.
Kezia, if I could bring you in, another thing that Bob Neill said, which really struck me, was sort of a warning to all parties, really. He said that the whole Partygate affair and the Sue Gray report led to an undermining of trust, a loss of faith in politics in general.
Yes, and that's something we're deeply concerned about in my day job at the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow, because the evidence shows us that Partygate is affecting all political parties and all politicians. And it's happening at a time where general levels of trust in politicians were already very low and increasingly unequal. Unequal with particular regard to young people, those in low incomes, and women increasingly distrustful of the people who govern their lives. And those are the people that are most reliant on public services. So it's very, very dangerous time for the state of our political debate. And there is a manifesto, there's a set of plans, there's some ideas about how you can rebuild trust in politics and political processes. And I'm afraid right at the top of the evidence list about what you need to do to rebuild trust is to make sure that rules are followed and that when they're broken, consequences flow from those rules being broken. So how the Conservative Party, how the government, how the country reacts to things like Partygate is actually really important to the future of whether or not we trust the people that lead us.
And Bob Neill talked about a lack of, or a loss of, seriousness of purpose. People perhaps need to think that, politicians are in it for the big game, not the small game.
Well, I think there's definitely a stasis just now. If you look at the reaction last week to the mini budget that Rishi Sunak announced, there was a feeling that this was a package designed not necessarily to alleviate the cost of living crisis the country was faced with, but a package designed to move the story of Partygate on. Now we're in a situation where the Prime Minister will be worried about the 1922 committee and looking at which Conservative MPs might be the next to submit a letter, the next to fall out of line with his governing mission, and he'll seek to potentially buy them off with a bit of pork barrel politics. What can he do to keep those ministers, those PPSs on side? And this is an exercise in survival, but it's been happening for too long now, and it's materially affecting the long-term decisions the government's taking. It has an absence of a kind of philosophy of government. There is no long-term plan that's really identifiable by the people, and that's got to worry people in Number 10 as well.
We're going to move on now and talk about Russian oil. The EU has said that its new deal means that 90% of Russian oil imports will stop by the end of the year. Now, some analysts, I mean, there's many arguments here. This is a provocation. Actually, this might backfire because Moscow will just sell its energy on to its eastern neighbours. But Kezia, that takes time for contracts to be negotiated. That's still going to take time. So Russia will suffer economically in the short term.
Yes, and I think the more that it suffers in the short term, the better it is for the long-term strategy in Ukraine. I'm just really struck by the comments of the Latvian Prime Minister in the Times today, who says ultimately what we have to do is to starve Russia of the funds it needs to continue the war. And he says that we're getting a little bit bogged down and forgetting the bigger picture here. It's only money. It's the Ukrainians who are fighting for their lives. So I think that's the critical point.
William, what do you think? What kind of impact do you think this will have on Russia's economy?
Well, it has some impact. Of course, oil you can move around. And so this doesn't hit Russia that hard, stopping the sales of oil in Europe, because they can sell the oil in India, in China, and so on. And some people around the world will be making a lot of money out of buying Russian crude oil at discounted prices and then refining it into products they can sell at world prices. So Russia is still able to sell its oil. It's the gas that would be, it's cutting off buying the gas that would be the really damaging thing, because they can't move that around so easily. It has to go down the pipelines. And that is that the EU is finding more difficult. Now, they do have a plan to reduce that by 2/3 by the end of this year and stop it all by 2027. That's good. But they really should be looking to speed that up, because that is really what would hit the finances of the Putin regime.
And what else, William, do you think? I mean, you talked there about gas. Is there any other action that the EU could take to continue to kind of get its message across to Russia about what it's doing in Ukraine?
Well, I think we could do with the EU being more united than it has been about the diplomatic position and the military position. Because some countries, while many countries have offered lethal aid to Ukraine, like the UK and the US have been sending, some haven't been sending very much, it turns out, like Germany. And then we had the business a few days ago of the leaders of France and Germany having a long phone call with Putin, discussing a ceasefire, as if he's a reasonable person you can deal with, rather than war crimes having been committed on a vast scale, and all the evidence that even if you do a deal with him, he wouldn't stick to it. So I think there is still some weakness in these divisions around Europe, and the position of Estonia, Poland, countries like that, much more in line with the UK, is the right one, I think.
Kezia, what do you make of Joe Biden's decision not to supply a particular type of long-range weapon? Do you think that kind of cuts the legs off of any kind of Ukrainian defense?
I mean, I find it hard to understand the United States' position when it comes to Ukraine, given their position on so many other kind of global world affair issues. It must just be the distance from the problem in the eyes of Joe Biden. And I think in a second we might talk about what's happening in Taiwan and what that means for the future of the United States' relationship with China. But I've been a bit bemused by how President Biden has behaved and generally over Ukraine, as if he's just a third party, mildly disinterested. And I think we could really do with the United States taking a greater interest in this.
Let's move on to talking about Taiwan, as you've alluded to there, Kezia. William, you've written in the paper today, the Times today, about the need for the US to make it clear that it would defend Taiwan if there was a Chinese invasion. Has the US not already made that abundantly clear, or do you think actually the Chinese see some weakness there?
Well, I think the US position has been confused, and that's why I've written the article. It's been for a long time, it's been what they call strategic ambiguity. Keep China guessing about whether the US would protect Taiwan militarily. And that has served its purpose over the last 30 or 40 years, when there was only a very small risk of China trying to seize Taiwan. Now, the point of my column is we're entering a decade where there's a much higher risk of that. And so it's better if intentions are made clear at the outset. You don't want to be the United States saying at the last minute we are going to defend Taiwan when the Chinese are already getting ready to take it. That needs factoring in for the long term if we're going to avoid a war, a world war. And I give examples of how, one of the reasons the First World War began was because countries underestimated the intention of the other powers to defend small countries like Belgium. So we mustn't make that same mistake again.
Do you think the US would defend Taiwan?
Yeah, I think they would. Absolutely, I think they would, because I think if they failed to do so, you would see the collapse of their alliances across the Asia Pacific, the humiliation of US power, that Japan and South Korea would lose faith in American protection, maybe develop their own nuclear weapons as a result. So you would really see a disaster for US and Western interests if they didn't protect Taiwan. And that's really my argument, that since that's the case, they might as well say so, that they would do so, and make that's the best way to deter a war over Taiwan. Is probably the only way in the long term that we can prevent it.
Kezia, what should the EU's position be in all of this? Has China been emboldened by what's happened in Ukraine, and should the EU stand alongside the US?
Well, I think China's certainly learning an awful amount from the Ukraine situation. William refers to that in his column. They'll be studying very closely the errors that Russia have made along the way and making sure that they don't repeat them. And William also argues in his column that China would have a much more sophisticated approach to any future conflict. I mean, I must say, reading William's column this morning, you can always rely on him to address the serious issues of the day. But this one is a central issue to the future of humanity, as he describes it, which is a bit much for me over my muesli this morning. Just
sorry about that.
Yeah.
Because that is a good point you make there, because for a lot of citizens of the UK, and perhaps I think the EU as well, the future of Taiwan is not front and centre for them. And perhaps, although William says, yes, the US will definitely defend Taiwan, do you think a lot of people, as you say, waking up in their breakfast are saying, right, Taiwan, that really engages me?
Well, I think that's because we don't expect your average citizen to understand the nuances of geopolitics to this degree, which is why we have elected representatives in the way that we do to concern themselves with these matters. But a bit more public education about why this relationship with Taiwan really matters, not just in terms of, peace across the globe, but in day-to-day economics and business, like the production of semiconductors and how reliant we are on being able to access those cheaply to keep our economies moving, and the degree to which they relate to our ability to drive up productivity and keep on top of technological advances. This isn't just about peace over the next 10 years. This is about the functioning of our economy today. So yes, we should all understand these issues a bit better, but we don't need to know every single bit of the detail, obviously.
I'm just looking on social media at a letter that has dropped from the former Cabinet Minister Andrea Leadsom. It's a letter of two halves, shall we say. The first half, she says, I think the Prime Minister was right to commission Sue Gray to carry out her investigation. I note that the thorough investigation by the Met Police concluded the rule breaking by the Prime Minister personally was limited to a surprise birthday party, etc., etc. However, there is a however in this, and you can hear it coming. On studying the report carefully, Andrea Leadsom says, it is painfully clear to me that given the extent and severity of rule breaking taking place over a 20-month period, it is extremely unlikely that senior leaders were unaware of what was going on. I therefore agree with Sue Gray's conclusion that there have been significant failures of leadership, both political and official, in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office. I am determined to be clear about my views as a matter of personal integrity. The conclusion I have drawn from the Sue Gray report is that there have been unacceptable failings of leadership that cannot be tolerated and are the responsibility of the Prime Minister. She finishes by saying, each of my Conservative MP colleagues and I must now decide individually on what is the right course of action that will restore confidence in our government. William Hague, she took a bit of time to get there, but she got there in the end in terms of what she wanted to say. What do you make of this letter from Andrea Leadsom?
I think it confirms what we were saying earlier. I said this was a slow fuse. Well, such a letter from, a senior figure, Andrea Leadsom, is the fuse. The fuse is getting closer to the dynamite here, and it's speeding up. So I think that's just another indication the Conservative Party is moving faster towards a vote of confidence or no confidence, a leadership ballot. which I said earlier could come next week or at the end of June. A few more letters like that, and it will come next week.
Goodness me. Kezia?
Yes, just as we were describing earlier, I mean, I think this now feels inevitable, and I think advisors around the Prime Minister might be well advised to say to him that the sooner the better. If it were to happen the next couple of days, I think he would win it handsomely. If he's allowed to stew for weeks yet, and people can mobilise and leadership campaigns can start to build, and there is a viable alternative behind one candidate, then I think that inbuilt majority of around 180 that you would expect to back the Prime Minister right now would dwindle pretty fast. Then he could be in very deep trouble. So we might be back into sort of John Major territory here.
Quite a significant. Thank you very much, Kezia Dugdale, and William Hague, the former Conservative leader. A great line there from him. The fuse is getting closer to the dynamite.